Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Aerial Perspective, where I, Ariel, share my perspective on what I think, do, eat, or whatever. In this video, I'll be comparing the taste and the cooking process of the wet brine and the dry brine corned beef that I made in the last video. So let's jump right in. First, we need to rewind a bit. I unfortunately lost some footage, so you will have to enjoy this reenactment. Starting with the wet brine corned beef, I removed the meat from the liquid and discarded the brine. The recipe called for me to rinse the meat, but I forgot. I placed in the crock pot 1 onion, 3 stalks of celery, and 3 carrots, chopped. Then the roast went on top of all of that, and then I added a Guinness, some chicken stock, just enough to cover everything that was in the pot about 3/4 of the way. I also used some spices, the similar ones that were in the brine, including mustard seed, bay leaves, clove, a cardamom pod or 2, and some peppercorns. I set all of this on low for 7 to 8 hours, and then I let it cool and refrigerated it overnight. I did the exact same thing with the dry brine corned beef, with only a couple of changes. The Julia Child recipe that I followed called for a desalting technique. After the 2 weeks of curing time was up, I removed the meat from the bag and placed it in the Cambro container, which I then filled with cold water. I changed the water twice over the course of about 36 hours, keeping it in the fridge to soak between exchanges. I taste tested the meat before cooking the entire roast, just to make sure that it wasn't too salty. No, I'd say this is ready for stewing. I used an Oktoberfest beer instead of a Guinness to cook this one, and otherwise it was done the exact same way. So some chicken stock, maybe some water to help top it off, same amount of veggies, same spices. I just really wanted to show the color and how gray it is. It's not as firm on the outside as the other one was, but it's firm in the middle. You can kind of tell how the water has affected it as far as the texture is concerned. Anyways, I'm gonna let this go on low for 8 to 10 hours, and we will see what it looks like tomorrow. The reason that I cooled these down overnight in the fridge is because it made it easier to slice the meat, and I was able to take out the veggies from the braising liquid more easily, which if you're going to keep the braising liquid and use it to reheat, it's just easier to handle it cold. And the vegetables have done their job. They have flavored the meat, and I'm not going to be reusing them for anything. I mean, you can just tell right off the bat that the color is pretty even throughout. It's this brownish color. Obviously this is fully cooked, but it's pretty even. I mean, you see some difference in tone right here, but I don't believe that this is from the curing. I believe that this is just different muscular texture, attributing to like the slightly darker hue, but it doesn't really show a difference in curing color. It's a deep brown. It's not pink at all. And just for comparison, I'm gonna pull a little piece of the cured with curing salt corned beef. So for comparison, this is the wet cured corned beef that used curing salt. And this one was the dry brine that only used kosher salt. I mean, the color is noticeable right away. This is like a deep pink, kind of brownish magenta, and this is just straight up brown, well done cooked beef. I am now going to show the finished dishes with each kind of ground beef that I made, the wet brine and the dry brine. Let's give it a go. So I have the wet brine corned beef on my right and the dry brined corned beef on my left. Going for the dry brine. Now for the wet brine. I find this one to be much sweeter. I find this one to have more texture. This is much similar to just like a pot roast, whereas this has that like hammy, salty, but sweet flavor. This is more like a pot roast, but with like the spices I associate with corned beef. There is some of that reddish color. It's much, much more subtle. Here are my final thoughts, off the cuff. I personally like the flavor of the wet brine corned beef, which was cured with kosher salt and the pink curing salt, a lot more. The dry brine corned beef, I think that the process is much more involved. You have to turn the meat every day. You're supposed to massage it. You're supposed to really take care of it every day throughout the curing process. Now, after the curing process, the 2 weeks is up, it's more low maintenance after that. If you needed to preserve meat for longer, it's less evolved. You just would need to turn it every few days or so. I think that the flavor of the dry brined is more just like a pot roast. It has a bit of that cured flavor, that like hammy, bacony type of like tang to it, but it's very subtle. It doesn't have that typical taste of the corned beef that you might be used to, except for the spices used. The spices are the same. There's also no sugar in that recipe, so I think that plays into it a lot, because in the cured version, the wet brine version, you get a lot of sweetness from all that brown sugar. And then all of the bay leaf, the clove and everything kind of just plays into that. And all those warming spices and the sugar just kind of bring out the sweetness. And the flavor of the wet brine is just better for me. Just packs more of a punch. The color, I can take it or leave it. It also seemed more tender. It's the exact same cut, so I think the process actually made it more tender. The wet brining method is way more hands-off. I just made the brine, let it cool, put it over the meat, put the lid on, did not touch it for 2 weeks. So, and it came out fine. There was some variation in the color when it was raw, but once it was cooked, you couldn't tell at all. So you might need to turn it a little bit more, but I don't personally see the need, because once it was cooked, it didn't matter. I believe, just from the research I've done and all the recipes I've read through, that the Julia Child recipe with the dry brine that only uses kosher salt is more of the old school way to do it. That method is most similar to how people have been curing meat for hundreds of years, because curing salt wasn't on the market until within the last 100. So I'm glad that I've experienced that, and I think that I have a better idea of what they were eating, and I really respect that. But in the future, I will probably stick with the other method. But I'm also interested in maybe combining the methods. What about a wet brine method with only kosher salt? Would that help with the tenderness? Because I have found sometimes that when curing other types of meat, especially chickens, a wet brine will produce a juicier chicken. So that could have something to do with it. I am also interested in trying a Reuben burger with the dry brined beef. The cooking methods, the ratios from the recipes all seemed great. The only criticism I have for the Joy of Cooking recipe, the wet brine, is that there might have been too much pink salt. However, I don't believe that I weighed it. It gave a weight, but I just used teaspoons. That can affect it a lot, so that could have affected the color. The color of it coming out of the brine and out of the crock pot, actually, was jarringly pink, like deep, bright magenta. And it wasn't super appealing. It looked a little bit neon. Next time I'll just weigh it, but I don't believe it was unsafe. So that is my perspective, and I hope that you have found it insightful. Catch me next time for more cooking videos, more perspectives on what I do, what I think, how I feel. Let me know what you might want to see me cook next. Bye.